Hi, and the changing nature of modern gaming means that far from the days when we could buy a game and we owned that game, we could play it year after year, decade after decade as necessary, as long as you had a computer to actually play it. Now we're increasingly playing games that are only made for online use, which means that as the game changes, the things that were are left behind. In World of Warcraft, this has been ever present with the people who have been asking for vanilla WoW to come back, or vanilla servers to come back, and led to the pressure that eventually caused Blizzard to announce at BlizzCon that they would indeed be bringing classic WoW servers back. Now, to look at this, we have to consider that there are basically three types of player when it comes to the evolution of a game. There are those who loved the game as it originally was and will quite happily play it in that form for years and maybe even decades to come if given the chance. There are those who loved the game but want to see it move on. They need change, they expect change. When a new announcement is made for an expansion, they want to know what aspects of the game are changing. They have their own personal list, but there are other things that they'll get excited about as well. And if that doesn't happen, they will go elsewhere for new gaming experiences. Then finally, there are those who just didn't like the original game and only came to World of Warcraft as a result of the changes that have been taking place. These are players who won't be playing Classic at all, or even if they try it out, they'll quickly decide it's not for them. Now, inevitably in a situation like this, it's the first group that gets left behind. They potentially don't like the changes. It's not just adding something. If something's adding something, that's fine. But usually, even when you just add something, you do take away an experience. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to go through how vanilla has evolved, and I'm going to focus on the sort of group PvE content and discuss the ways in which those experiences are now different. It's going to be in two parts. This is the first part, which will take us to the end of Cataclysm. So in vanilla, raiding was 40 man. You had light attunements for each one, light being that it was very easy to do. To get attuned for Molten Core, you simply had to do something in Blackrock Depths. To get attuned for Blackwing Lair, you simply had to do Upper Blackrock Spire. Anchorage was a server-wide event, and Naxxramas you simply had to either be exalted with Argent Dawn, which if, like me, you ran Stratham and Scholomance a lot, you could easily be, or you just handed over a load of resources, gold, whatever, to get the attunement to that. So it wasn't very difficult, it wasn't very demanding. There were also 20-man raids for a more casual experience, a more alt-friendly experience, a more pug-friendly experience. Even though the level of challenge was still there, there were things on offer that weren't in normal raids. You didn't have tier gear as such, but you would still have sets associated with it, as well as other things like mounts to appeal to people to make them sort of want to run it. Dungeons were fairly tough, and when you got to level cap, and whether this is a combination of the difficulty of the dungeon or just the fact that most of us didn't really know what we were doing, nonetheless, it was hard as balls when you got there. Largely, you could argue because of gear as well having an effect. It was quite common for people at level cap to still be wearing gear that was green level quality from like level 40s or early 50s. This meant you had the possibility of raiding those dungeons. It was not at all common to get to level cap and do the high level dungeons. You would raid them, 10-man raiding Scholomance or Strathome or Blackrock Depths or even lower Blackrock Spire. And that allowed you to simply go in there and gear. You couldn't complete the quests in there. There were a lot of quests associated with dungeons. Couldn't complete those in a raid group. But you could go in with 9 other people, bowl over the bosses, and get some gear. Once you'd geared up, ironically, that's when you 5-manned the dungeons and then completed your quests. Now, when it comes to quests, they were very different as well. It wasn't just the hub-based quests that we have now. Those did exist. You could often get quests that would send you across multiple zones, across both continents even. Sometimes a simple quest line could send you all over the place. You'd be exploring lots of different lands. And maybe the reward at the end of it wasn't necessarily even worth the effort, but you did get to explore a lot of the world. With the first expansion, Burning Crusade, a lot of aspects of these changed instantly. Raiding became 25-man for the hardcore experience and 10-man for the more casual stuff. Karazhan was a pug and alt favourite throughout Burning Crusade, though even then you didn't expect a pug group to clear it in week 1. Attunements were much more involved as well. Even the Karazhan attunement required a hefty amount of gameplay. There were serious barriers to catching up later in the expansion as well. In order to attune yourself To Karazhan, you had to complete quests involving heroic dungeons, more about those in a moment. To attune yourself, for example, for Black Temple, you had to get yourself attuned to Hyjal. You had to, for that, get yourself bosses killed in both Tempest Keep and Serpent's Right Cavern. And bearing in mind that once most guilds had got those on their players, they didn't generally go back to those to run them. So as a new player or a re-rolling player, your opportunities to get those attunements were a little bit limited unless you could find a raid guild that would boost you through it. Now when it comes to the dungeons, once you got to level cap, of course, the level of gear was much more in tune with that level, so the standard dungeons would be challenging but easily doable. Enter the heroic dungeons. These were a very tricky affair that would test even good quality PvE players. In fact, just call out Heroic Shadow Labs to a group of WoW players, and if anyone visibly shudders, you know they played TBC at that time. When it came to quests, they were much more of the hub nature. No sprawling quest lines taking you across multiple zones now. This was very much about go to an area, collect all the quests, go to this other area, complete them, go back, get a breadcrumb quest to the next one, and rinse and repeat. This became the standard that has persisted ever since. With the release of Wrath of the Lich King, raiding changed yet again. There was still 25-man raiding and there was still 10-man raiding. But this time it was of the same raid, so every raid would have a 25-man and a 10-man version, linked to difficulties. The 10-man was easier, the 25-man for the more hardcore, but then that wasn't enough. With the launch of the second tier Ulduar, heroic mode raiding came in, which was triggered by a special event. This led to an extra level of achievement for your raiders. And speaking of achievements, this was probably Wrath of the Lich King's major development for the game. So now when you completed key bits of content, you would get achievements for them, not just achievement points, sometimes titles, and some achievements even led to special rewards such as mounts. With the different difficulties of raid, you also had different levels of the same gear. Item level wasn't in the game just yet, but it would soon be coming as the result of an add-on which people were using to filter out those applying to join a pug raid group. No longer were people content with simply giving them a manual inspection. Even though we'd had the armory since Burning Crusade, they wanted a number. Are you above this number? If you are, you're good enough to join my raid. If you are not, then you are not. Key, lots of people putting on the most unsuitable gear they could to maximise that score. Attunements had completely died out for raids at this point, never really to be seen again. Dungeons lost the difficulty of the Burning Crusade heroic modes, but still retained some challenge for players. The looking for dungeon tools started to become genuinely useful, but still hadn't quite reached the level we have now. You still had to physically get to the dungeon. You would have tanks leaving in a strop if they didn't get their way, knowing you would have a job to replace them. Now with the launch of Cataclysm, massive amounts changed. 25 and 10 man changed in concept again. Now they weren't supposed to be indicators of difficulty, but of coziness. 25 man for those who wanted the epic raiding experience, 10 man for those who wanted to do the raids, but in a smaller friendship group. The difficulty was now purely between setting normal or heroic mode for the fights. You would get the same item level gear from both. Speaking of item level, it was now in the game. No longer an inspection. You now had, as a raid leader for pugs, a link for achievements, item level, which you could look up on the armory from a distance. Pugs had been increasingly difficult to get into with the ever more demanding requirements set by most raid leaders. Enter the flurry of posts on official forums complaining about this, only to be met with responses of, well, start your own group then. This has been cycling around now for years. The 1 to 60 zones were completely revamped. Hub-based quests, the only type of quest on offer now, whilst at the same time the looking for dungeon tool came to full fruition. It was ironic, really, that at the same time that they brought us completely new quests and zones for old content, they also brought us the ability to never set foot in those zones, as you could now level up by queuing for dungeons without ever setting foot outside your main city once you'd reached level 15. The initial dungeons brought back a level of difficulty that shocked much of the player base at launch. The backlash meant that Blizzard would seemingly keep basic access dungeons childishly simple for all time now. Even the mid-expansion dungeons, which had grown to help people to gear up, especially if coming into the expansion late or starting a new character, lacked any significant level of challenge at all, unlike with the previous 2 expansions. Finally, Cataclysm brought with it the concept of Ellafar during the final tier. This was a form of raiding where you just queued up to get in, with no checks beyond one of a minimum item level. There was still no personal loot at this time, so people would go in friend groups with everyone needing on an item, only to physically trade it to the one in the group who really needed it. So if you went in on your own, you had very little chance of actually successfully acquiring an item. So from vanilla to Cataclysm, we've gone from large sociable raid groups to smaller, more focused ones, but with different forms of each raid in an attempt to accommodate everyone, regardless of commitment and skill. Dungeons have gone from hour or 2 long marathons to short 10-minute sprints with a group of people you never talk to. Flying around the world at this point became commonplace, acquiring full sets of epics became the norm and wasn't a long process, and everything you did in game became an achievement stamped on your account with the date accomplished. In part 2, I'll be taking us from the end of Cataclysm to the present day at the start of the final tier of Legion. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a like and comment. Don't forget to subscribe if it's the first time to the channel, and until next time, I'll see you later.